Well, good morning once again. It's interesting the things you can find in the dictionary, sometimes how accurately something is defined. I thought I would look up Easter this morning in the Webster's Unabridged Dictionary and see what they had to say. And I thought it was a very good definition. A Paschal feast, originally a pagan festival in honor of the goddess of spring, held in April. So that's the way the dictionary defines Easter. A Paschal feast. Paschal is the Latin term. It comes from the Latin word for Passover. So it is a festival that really is sort of a substitute connected with Passover, but it specifically is originally a pagan festival in honor of the goddess of spring. Easter, the name is spelled a little differently, and ultimately goes back to the Babylonian form Ishtar or Astarte, several different ways of spelling it in different languages. But that's sort of interesting. There's a letter. You know, the Easter often coincides with the time of the spring festivals. Usually comes close, but it never comes on the actual day. In fact, they have a rule about that if it ever lands on the right day, they move it a week. So they want to make sure. I think it's interesting what's said. It's normally set for the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox, March the 21st. There's a letter that's preserved in the writings of Eusebius. Eusebius was a Catholic bishop and historian who flourished in the time of the 4th century. And he was present and actually served as like the clerk or the secretary at the Council of Nicaea. And he reprints the details of the Council of Nicaea. In fact, he's the source of most of our information on that. He wrote a book entitled Ecclesiastical History, and he gives a lot of historical background of the first 3 centuries or so. And one of the things he reprints in his work is a letter of Emperor Constantine. Now, Constantine was a Roman emperor who came to power in the beginning of the 4th century. Emperor Constantine, as you read his history, was a devotee of the sun god. Sol Invictus, as he was called in Latin, it just means the unconquerable sun, S-U-N. In fact, Constantine on the coins is always pictured with this sort of radiating light coming out from his head, which was connected with the pictures of the sun god. And that's the way he was normally pictured. He actually did not officially become a Christian until on his deathbed when he had himself sprinkled. But nevertheless, that didn't keep him from summoning a council, a church council, over which he himself presided. And this is the Council of Nicaea in 321. And here's the letter that he wrote in the aftermath. Constantine Augustus to the churches. Now, Augustus was a title that the Roman emperors had taken to themselves, beginning with Augustus, the nephew of Julius Caesar. Augustus in Latin basically means reverend, someone to be revered or worshipped. We talk about, use that term, a very august presence. Well, it means an awe-inspiring or worshipful or reverend. All of those would be ways of rendering the term into English. So he continued to consider himself taking this title. Now, God says back in Psalm 111, verse 10, that holy and reverend is His name. He's the only one worthy of worship, worthy to be revered, worthy to be held in awe. But Augustus Caesar, the nephew of Julius, thought that he was certainly worthy of that, so he attached that title. His name was Octavian, but he attached the title Augustus and used that as his, most people consider that his name, though actually it was a title. He was the Reverend Caesar. You could render it into English, the Caesar who was worthy of awe and being revered and worshipped. Well, Constantine Augustus to the churches. He said, having experienced in the flourishing state of public affairs the greatness of the divine goodness, I thought it especially incumbent on me to endeavor that the happy multitudes of the Catholic Church should preserve one faith and harmoniously join in their devotions to Almighty God. But this could not otherwise be effected in a firm and solid manner than by an examination for this purpose of whatever pertains to our most holy religion, by all the bishops, or the greater part of them at least, assembled together. Having therefore convened as many as possible, I myself being present, and as it were one of you, everything was examined. And when the question arose concerning the most holy day of Easter, now let me call something to your attention. This is an English translation. This was in Greek and in Latin, the forms. The term isn't Easter. Any of you who speak French or Spanish realize that in French or Spanish, they don't use the word Easter. They use a Latin form of Passover. In German and in English and in the Scandinavian languages, the term Easter is used. But if you go to France or Spain or Italy, you'll find that they don't use the term Easter. They refer to Pâques in French, or Pascha. This was the term. This was actually the way the confusion originated. You know, it's interesting when you look at how changes are made and are introduced. The initial argument was not, should we change Passover to Easter? It was, which day should we observe Passover? That was the way the argument was presented in Latin. So anyway, it goes on. He said, the question arose concerning the most holy day of Easter. It was decreed by common consent to be expedient that this festival should be celebrated on the same day by all in every place. Because at the time Constantine called this Council of Nicaea, there was a considerable divergence of opinion. It seemed, he went on to say, truly in the first place, it seemed to everyone a most unworthy thing that we should follow the custom of the Jews in the celebration of this most holy solemnity, who, polluted wretches, stained their hands with a nefarious crime. Now, he lays it on a little thick. Of course, he omits to mention that it was the Roman governor who actually signed the death decree, wasn't it? It was Roman soldiers who actually carried him out and nailed him to the cross. Now, the Jewish religious leadership had their part in it, but was the Roman government totally off the hook? Wasn't it a Roman governor that they came to that that served as the judge? Wasn't it a Roman governor that caved in to political expediency? You notice, when you read the gospel accounts, you notice that politics hasn't changed a whole lot. Most politicians, I won't say that there are never exceptions, but overwhelmingly, most politicians sort of do the equivalent of taking an opinion poll to find out whether they're for something or against it. They want to find out what's popular. And Pilate was afraid of having a riot on his hands. People were getting upset. He knew that Jesus was innocent. In fact, the gospel accounts make the point that he knew that it was because of envy that the priesthood had delivered Jesus to him. They had all this thing trumped up. Pilate knew that. He was the Roman governor. He was the judge, and he was a perceptive enough man. He read between the lines. He knew what was going on. He knew this was an innocent man. The Romans prided themselves on Roman law and Roman justice. But you see, when push came to shove, Pilate's political career was really the most important thing. He said, if I find this man innocent, which I know him to be, and these people stir up a riot and they get a bunch of commotion going on, and they write a letter back to Rome accusing me of things, That's going to be bad for my career. I may get sacked as governor. I may get called back to Rome to answer these charges. He knew the charges were fictitious, but he became afraid to rock the boat. He realized that this might be a black mark on his political career. Now, it's interesting when you read history that Pilate ended up with a black mark on his political career and got sacked several years later, hauled back to Rome in disgrace. You know, when people take the way of expediency, when they don't do the right thing, they do what they think will be the popular thing, sooner or later it's going to blow up in their face. And the consequences come back on them. It's interesting as you go through the gospel accounts of the time right around the crucifixion of Christ, and you read the reasoning of different people. The religious leaders said, if we let him alone, everybody's going to believe on him, and the Romans will come away and will come and take away our place in our nation. So we better murder him. Now, they did get rid of him, that's right. And you know what? The Romans still came and took away their place in their nation. They did. The judgment of God came on. What people leave out when they follow the way of expediency, whether it's Pilate, whether it's the Jewish religious leaders, or whomever it may be, what people leave out when they follow the way of expediency is that there is a real God. And God takes note. And so when people do what they know they ought not do, they are ultimately going to wind up giving an accountability, and so many times the consequences come on them. Well, anyway, let's go on and read you a little more of Constantine's decree. He said, it is fit, therefore, that rejecting the practice of this people, talking about the Jews, we should perpetuate to all future ages the celebration of this rite in a more legitimate order, which we have kept from the first day of our Lord's Passion even to the present time. Let us then have nothing in common with the most hostile rabble of the Jews. Let us withdraw ourselves, my much honored brethren, from that most odious fellowship. Now, you know, as we come down through the centuries, and you find that particularly in Catholic areas, the Jews have generally been on the receiving end of some pretty strong persecution. Well, where do you think Adolf Hitler didn't invent some of these terms and some of these approaches. I mean, you read what Constantine said. It was nothing new. It was nothing new. That most odious fellowship. It is indeed in the highest degree preposterous that they should superciliously vaunt themselves that truly without their instruction we cannot properly observe this rite. You see, the issue came down. It was an issue of part of the matter was an issue of the calendar, and whether it was to be observed according to the calendar as the Jews preserved. And so there were those in the church, particularly in Asia Minor, who were called quartodecimans. That meant that they observed the Passover on the 14th. Quartodeciman is a Latin word for 14th. We would call them, the 14thers. They insisted that the Passover had to be observed on the 14th. And they followed the reckoning of the Jewish calendar. Now, Constantine is upset by that. Let's go on. I'll read you a little more. He says, it's in the highest degree preposterous that they should superciliously vaunt themselves that truly without their instruction we can't properly observe this rite. In other words, they say, here's the proper time. For what can they rightly understand? Who, after the tragical death of our Lord, being deluded and darkened in their minds, are carried away by an unrestrained impulse wherever their inborn madness may impel them. Hence, therefore, it is that even in this particular, they do not perceive the truth, so that continually wandering in the grossest error, instead of duly reforming their calculations, they commemorate the Passover twice in the same year. Well, they didn't. What he meant was that the Passover, because of the reckoning of the calendar and the fact that sometimes there is a 13th month, that twice within the same Roman year the Passover may be observed. If you want to look on the Roman calendar, you'll find that occasionally we may observe the Passover in April of one year and March of the next, and so you could have, in that sense, within the same Roman year, the Passover would come twice within the same Roman year. At this time, remember, the Romans were beginning their year on the 1st of March, so it wasn't moved back to the 1st of January until a little later period. So they were still recognizing the first of the year on the 1st of March. So on that reckoning within the same Roman year, it was conceivable. So Constantine thinks that the Jews need to reform their calculations, and he has all sorts of names for them. Why then should we follow those who are acknowledged to labor under a grievous error? So he goes on about this, and let's come on down a little further. As it is necessary that this fault should be so amended that we may have nothing in common with the usage of these parricides and murderers of our Lord. And as that order is most convenient, which is observed by all the churches of the West, as well as those of the southern and northern parts of the world, and also by some in the East. It was judged, therefore, to be most equitable and proper, and I pledge myself to this arrangement, that the custom which prevails with one consent in the city of Rome, and throughout all Italy, Africa, and Egypt. Oh, so that's where they want to go. Go to Rome, Italy, Africa, Egypt. That'd be the source. So he goes on to say that it is also, but also that it is most religious and equitable that all should wish what the strictest reason seems to require, and to have no fellowship with the perjury of the Jews. And to sum up the whole in a few words, it was agreeable to the common judgment of all that the most holy feast of Easter should be celebrated on one and the same day. And that was, of course, the day that was celebrated in Rome. Now, interestingly, Eusebius preserves in his book an exchange of letters that dates back to a period of over about 150 years earlier than that. He reports in his writings of a dispute, because the dispute over the observance of Passover or Easter, the dispute over whether to observe the 14th day of the first month or to observe a different day, Easter Sunday, was a dispute that went back much earlier. In fact, we read of a letter that was written in the latter part of the 2nd century. It was written by a man by the name of Polycrates, who was a bishop or a church leader in the area of Asia Minor. And Polycrates had been a disciple of Polycarp, who in turn had been a disciple of the Apostle John. And Polycrates wrote a letter to Anicetus, who was the bishop of Rome, in the latter part of the 2nd century, disputing about this matter, because Anicetus had tried to insist that everyone observe the way the Romans were doing it. And Polycrates wrote him a letter, and he said, look, he said, I observed the Passover on the 14th. He said, I observed the Passover on the 14th with Polycarp, who himself observed it with the Apostle John. We know what is the correct day. I got it directly from a man who got it from the Apostle John, who was the last living participant in Christ's final Passover. John certainly ought to have known when it was. And he, Polycarp observed it with John, and I observed it and learned it from Polycarp. And he went on to say that, mentioning the fact that he had been, he was by this time an elderly man, that he had been himself over 60 years in the Lord as a converted person. And he said, and my family before me, so he came from a family that had been Christian, and he said, all of my family, I had all of my family. He says, we observe the day that the people throw away the leaven. He says, we observe the day that the people throw away the leaven. That was his phrase. And he said, before me, great lights in Asia are fallen asleep. And he enumerates such as John, and such the Apostle John, and such as Philip, the deacon mentioned there in Acts chapters 6 and 8. He mentions different ones there in Asia Minor. And he says these all observe the 14th day as the Passover. And so he went on to tell Anicetus, he said, I'm not at all intimidated by those things with which you threaten me, because Anicetus had threatened that he was going to excommunicate everybody in Asia Minor who wouldn't go along with the Roman way of doing things. And Polycrates said, I'm in no way intimidated by that with which you threaten me, because those that are greater than I have said we ought to obey God rather than men. And it's interesting, Eusebius records all that. He preserves the letter and preserves the record. So this was an ongoing dispute. It's interesting, Anicetus, we even know the date. We know the time when Roman Easter began to be observed. Because Anicetus, in his response, said that he was duty-bound to preserve the tradition of the bishops before him in Rome, going back to Bishop Sixtus, that they had done it this way since that time. Well, Sixtus, if you check the history on it, basically is generally dated somewhere from about 115 A.D. on up to about 135 A.D. Sort of that. The figures may vary a year or two depending on the source, but that's the approximate time period within a year or two, one way or the other. So it's interesting that even the Roman bishop traced their practice not back to Peter, or not back to Christ, but he traced it back to a man by the name of Sixtus, who was the leader of the Roman Church within, the first few years, within about 15 or 20 years after the death of the Apostle John. So shortly after John's death, there came to prominence a man in Rome who was able to introduce something that was different. And within a short time, that became established in Rome, spread out to Italy and Egypt and the surrounding areas, and now here we are about 200 years at the time of Constantine, about 200 years after the time of Sixtus. And even 200 years later, the celebration of Easter Sunday was predominant, but there were churches in Asia Minor, in the area. Where do we find the last places that were observing the Passover? Observing the true Passover, observing the 14th day of the first month. Where do we find them? We find them in Asia Minor. We find them in places like Ephesus and Smyrna. Places where in earlier generations we had found Polycrates and Polycarp, where the Apostle John ended his life. Churches that had been raised up by the Apostle Paul. Churches where the Apostle John ended his life. Churches where his disciples were the immediate ones who presided over them. Now, if this was a change that had come from God, you would certainly think Paul, as the apostle to the Gentiles, would have known it, and he would have instructed them in it to begin with. The Apostle John, described as the apostle whom Jesus loved, certainly he would have known. He was right there. He was one of the 12. He was with Jesus Christ. He was the last living participant in Christ's final Passover. So, when you find that the place that has preserved the proper Passover observance is the place where John spent his final years and where his successors continued, and those were the areas that held on the longest. Actually, what happened in the aftermath of this, Constantine began systematic state persecution, and we find whole groups of people then in the 4th century having to uproot from Asia Minor and actually migrate up across the mountains into Armenia. And that's where we pick up the story as we trace the true church in the 5th and 6th centuries, is we find people that had been dislocated from Asia Minor. In fact, it's interesting, when they founded locations up in Armenia, many of them were actually called by the name of some of these cities from Asia Minor where they had fled. That's sort of a common thing. You know, you look at the place names in the United States that take their name from places in England, or in other cases maybe places in Germany, for instance, if a whole group of people came over and settled. Very common for people to name a new location after the place where they left. So anyway, it's an interesting story as you go through it. And what we find is that there was a great controversy that was finally settled by the Roman government. Not based upon the Bible, not based upon the teachings of Christ, but based upon human ideas and human traditions that had their origin in Rome. Now, I want to use that sort of to set the stage because as it turns out this year, of course, the celebration of Easter comes during the days of unleavened bread, and in fact is going to be tomorrow. And this is tied in with the idea that Jesus was crucified on Good Friday and raised from the dead on Sunday morning, Easter Sunday. This is the whole explanation that is brought in as to why things are celebrated as they are rather than on the days that the Scripture enjoins. I think it's important for us to go back and to understand clearly why we do what we do and what is the biblical basis of it. Now, to begin with, let's go back to the book of Leviticus, chapter 23. The Eternal spoke unto Moses, Leviticus 23:1, and said, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them concerning the feasts of the Eternal, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feasts. So, Moses, and this is here given in the book of Leviticus, Levitical priesthood, was to proclaim these holy convocations. Verse 4, These are the feasts of the Eternal, even holy convocations, which you shall proclaim in their seasons. They were to be announced. These are seasonal convocations. They come at a particular time of the year. And he goes on, verse 5, In the 14th day of the first month at evening, technically the term here is dusk, between the two evenings. In other words, between the period of sunset and total darkness, is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread unto the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. In the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein. That is, of course, what we did this past Thursday. But you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Eternal 7 days. Now, the offerings there were offerings that were made every single day of the year, morning and evening. The offerings and the whole sacrificial system was added under the Levitical administration. Jesus Christ came as one sacrifice for sin forever. But, you know, the fact that there is not there are not Levitical sacrifices taking place doesn't do away with the holy days any more than it does away with every morning and every evening. You had a morning sacrifice and an evening sacrifice. You know, it's interesting. Sometimes the question comes up, and so I'd like to address it here. Some will go through Leviticus 23, and they say, well, now, we eat unleavened bread for 7 days, days of unleavened bread. We dwell in temporary dwellings during Feast of Tabernacles. We fast on the Day of Atonement. Why don't we blow trumpets on the Feast of Trumpets? Do you know the answer? Well, the answer is who is being instructed. Every individual was to eat unleavened bread. Every individual was to fast on atonement. Every individual was to dwell in temporary dwellings. But every individual was not to blow trumpets on the Feast of Trumpets. The only ones who were authorized to blow the trumpet on the Feast of Trumpets were the priests. As those instructions are elsewhere. Here it just says it is a memorial of the blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. That's mentioned in verse 24. But as you go on through the detailed instructions, it was the priests who sounded the shofar. You see, we follow the instructions that are given to us as individuals. We don't follow the instruction that was given to the Levitical priesthood in the sense that there were ceremonies that they were to carry out distinct from the ceremonies that are the particular things that individuals were to do. We follow the things that we are commanded to do as individuals, but not those things that pertain to the temple and the Levitical priesthood responsibilities, because there is not a functioning temple or a functioning Levitical priesthood. And as you go through the details of those things, that these things have to be carried out in a particular manner. So the unleavened bread, as we saw back in Exodus chapter 12, we're to eat that in all our dwellings. So you don't need a temple to do that in. You do that in all your dwellings. So anyway, it tells us on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You eat unleavened bread. Then the 7th day is a holy convocation. Verse 8, you shall do no servile work. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When you're come into the land which I shall give you, and shall reap the harvest thereof, then you shall bring a sheaf of the firstfruits of your harvest unto the priest. And he shall wave the sheaf before the Eternal to be accepted for you on the morrow after the Sabbath. The priest shall wave it. And then they were to offer a particular offering, and they were to offer the food offering, as it mentions in verse 13. And verse 14, You shall eat neither bread, nor parched corn, nor green ears, until the selfsame day that you've brought an offering unto your God. It will be a statute forever throughout your generations and all your dwellings. So here was the instruction for the offering of the first fruits. They were to bring a sheaf of the first fruits of their harvest to the priest. Now, God gave them instruction in Leviticus 23. They were in the desert. They were in the Sinai wilderness. There were no crops. They were eating manna. So He gave them instructions about the holy days, and then He told them in verse 10, when you're come into the land, here is something additional that is to be done. When you come into the land and reap the harvest, bring a sheaf of the first fruits. This was something that could not be done until they had entered the land. But once they had entered the land, they were to bring a sheaf of the first fruits, and it was to be waved before the Lord to be accepted on the morrow after the Sabbath. The priest would wave it. This was something that came to the priest. This was a part of the Levitical priesthood functioning. And then, verse 15, you shall count from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. Even unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath shall you number 50 days. Then you offer a new food offering to the Lord. You shall bring out of your habitations 2 wave loaves, be of fine flour. They shall be baked with leaven. They are the first fruits unto the Lord. And it goes through the details of the sacrifice that was to be offered on that day. The priest was to wave the bread as a wave offering. And verse 21, you shall proclaim on the selfsame day that it may be a holy convocation unto you. You shall do no servile work therein. Now, here are 2 holy days, 2 festival seasons that are tied together. This day that is arrived at by counting 7 Sabbaths or 7 weeks is commonly known in the Old Testament by 2 names, either as the Feast of First Fruits or as the Feast of Weeks. We know it better by the Greek name that is used in the New Testament, Pentecost. Pentecost is derived from the Greek word for 50. If you count 7 weeks and go to the day after the 7th week, you've counted 50 days. You count 7 weeks and celebrate the day after the 7th week. So the Jews called it the Feast of Weeks because you counted 7 weeks. They also called it the Feast of First Fruits because the first fruits harvest was celebrated on that day. The Greeks used the term, Greek-speaking Jews used the term Pentecost, the 50th day. And that's the term that's used in the New Testament because it was written in Greek. So it's the one that we're most familiar with and that we most commonly use in the church. Though, any of the three terms or one is they're all correct. Now it's interesting if you notice the way the pattern of 7 runs through. The days of unleavened bread were celebrated for 7 days. During the days of unleavened bread, you started counting 7 weeks and arrived at the day of Pentecost. Then when you come on down in chapter 20 and verse 24, you find in the 7th month, you're to celebrate the rest of the festivals, beginning on the first day of the 7th month, and the 10th and the 15th, and then 7 days later on the 8th day, that great day, which is the 22nd of the 7th month. So you have 7 days, 7 weeks, and 7 months as you come through the beginning with the first month. You count 2 periods of 7, 14 days to come up to the Passover, and then after you celebrate the Passover, you have 7 days of unleavened bread. Then during those 7 days of unleavened bread, on the Sabbath during those 7 days of unleavened bread, the day after that Sabbath that comes during the days of unleavened bread, you begin the count of 7 weeks. Then, of course, there's also the count of 7 months. So you got 7 days and 7 weeks and 7 months. There's a significance all the way through. It's sort of interesting how the holy days mirror. The holy days begin and end with an 8-day period. You have the Passover on the 14th, and then beginning on the 15th, you have the 7 days of unleavened bread. So that is a 1-day festival, technically not a holy day, but a 1-day festival, followed by a 7-day festival. The holy days end, the festival seasons end in the fall, with the 7 days of the Feast of Tabernacles, followed by the last great day, the 8th day, a 1-day festival. So in each case you have a sort of a mirror. 1 day followed by 7 is the beginning, and it ends with 7 days followed by 1. So it's sort of like a mirror image of one another. And it's based on this pattern of 7s. And of course you go through the Bible beginning all the way back in Genesis 1, and you find this pattern of 7s with the days of the days of the week. There's even some interesting connection with some of that when you go back even to some of the patterns here with that. It's interesting, when you go back to Creation Week in Genesis chapter 1, it talks about, the 4th day of creation. Well, it's interesting what is described that occurs on the 4th day of creation. God made or appointed 2 great lights. That was on the 4th day of creation. Now, it's interesting, we know that a day is with the Lord as 1,000 years. If you come forward to the end of the 4th millennial day, Christ was born right toward the end of the 4th millennium. What was he? Well, he was the light of the world. Sort of interesting little parallel. We're right at the end of the 6th millennium. What is the 6th day? What's the preparation day? What are we doing? Well, we're preparing the way, aren't we? It's the time of preparation, because when the 7th day comes, the millennial Sabbath that God has reserved for himself. So it's interesting, just some of these little parallels and little connections that you find throughout the Scriptures. But let's take note here, because what we find described in Leviticus 23 directly ties in to the events surrounding the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And it's particularly appropriate that we go into it this year, because it just so happens this year the spring festivals fall on the same days of the week that they did in 31 AD, the final year of Christ's ministry. So, in other words, we find that and I'll show you that as we go through in the New Testament, exactly the way the holy days lined up in 31 AD, and it's exactly the way they do this year. So it makes it easy to understand. We celebrated Wednesday was the Passover. We celebrated the Passover service Tuesday evening, the beginning portion of Wednesday, and then on Thursday we celebrated the high day, the holy day, first day of unleavened bread, and then today, of course, is the Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread. And this would be the day in ancient Israel when this evening, standing out in a grain field right near Jerusalem, waiting, and just as the sun was just barely visible as the sun was setting, there would be a sheaf of grain that had already been tied up, that had already been tied up and was waiting there for the priest to make one swing of a scythe, and this set sheaf of grain, this one section that had been sort of tied up, he would stand there and with one strike would cut it loose. And the first sheaf had then been taken. That was brought back to the temple, and it was then the grain was taken off, and it was crushed up into flour, and it was made into. The grain was then presented before God on the morning of what would be tomorrow. It was presented before God, and then the harvest began that day, that first day of the week during the days of unleavened bread. And they spent the next 7 weeks in the course of harvesting. They started out with the barley, which ripened first, and over the course of the next several weeks, the barley ripened first, and then the wheat. And by the day of Pentecost, all of the first grain had been reaped, the barley, the winter wheat. And so at the end of the 7 weeks, they presented these 2 loaves to God on the day, the 50th day, the day of Pentecost, the day after the 7th week. We begin the count tomorrow. We count from today 7 weeks. Tomorrow will be the first day of the first week, and we count through 7 weeks. And then you come to the morrow after the 7th week, and that will be the day of Pentecost. And we'll be right back here to celebrate that particular festival. Now, we see what is brought out. Let's go to the New Testament, and let's see how this tied in. Jesus had made a prophecy in Matthew chapter 12. Matthew 12:38. Certain of the scribes and the Pharisees answered, saying, Master, we would see a sign from you. He answered and said unto them, An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and there shall no sign be given to it, but the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So Christ said the only sign that He was going to give to that generation that He was the Messiah was that He would be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. In John chapter 2, after Christ had cleansed the temple there at the first Passover of His ministry, John 2:18, the Jews said unto Him, What sign do you show unto us, seeing you've done these things? Jesus answered and said unto them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple in building, and will you rear it up in 3 days? But He spoke of the temple of His body. He wasn't talking about the temple, the physical temple there. He was talking about the temple of His body. When therefore He was first risen from the dead, His disciples remembered what He had said unto them. and they believed the Scripture. So, we find that Christ, again, when asked for a sign, said, destroy this temple, referring to His body, and I will raise it up in 3 days. He told the religious leaders, recorded in Matthew 12, 3 days and 3 nights I'll be in the heart of the earth. So Christ spoke of His death, and He spoke of the fact that He would be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Now you start counting. You know, it's little child who's even, in early elementary school, 2nd grade, you can count to 3. Second, third graders learn the days. They begin to learn the days of the week, and they can count to 3. You give a little child, a little second, third grader, and tell them, and they're going to have trouble coming up with 3 days and 3 nights from Friday to Sunday. As adults, we make things complicated, but the truth is always simple. Christ said He'd be in the grave 3 days and 3 nights. Now, let's notice, as we go through, we'll notice the gospel accounts. The confusion that comes in, people think, it's obvious. Because the day on which Christ was crucified is called the preparation day. And that's normally associated with Friday, the day before the weekly Sabbath. But as we just got through seeing in Leviticus 23, there's not only the weekly Sabbath, there are also annual Sabbaths that are proclaimed holy convocations in their seasons. Now, Christ was crucified on the preparation day, but was it the preparation day of the weekly Sabbath or the preparation day of an annual Sabbath? Well, that's answered for us in John 19:31. The Jews, therefore, because it was the preparation, that the bodies should not remain upon the cross on the Sabbath day. For that Sabbath day was an high day. It wasn't the weekly Sabbath, it was a high day Sabbath. Oh, so John adds in a detail, very important. That Sabbath, the Sabbath that was approaching, was a high day. And they besought Pilate that the legs might be broken, that they might be taken away. The prisoners would be taken down before the high day Sabbath began. Now, we just got through reading in Leviticus 23 that the 14th day of the first month at evening is the Lord's Passover, and on the 15th day is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And you eat unleavened bread for 7 days, and that first day, the 15th, is a holy convocation. It is a high day Sabbath. Now, the days of the month, the 14th, the 15th, these don't always fall on the same days of the week. This year, for instance, the 14th, the 14th day of the first month came on a Wednesday. And we observed the Passover at the beginning of that Wednesday, the evening portion of that day, which was Tuesday evening by our reckoning, Roman reckoning. Thursday was the high day. Now, as we're going to see, this is exactly the way that things lined up in the year of Christ's crucifixion. He celebrated the Passover with His disciples. That's what they had asked Him. The disciples had come to Him in Matthew 26:17 and said, "Where will you that we should prepare for you to eat the Passover?" They were going to eat the Passover. And Christ told them, as it is told them in verse 18, the Master said, "My time is at hand, I'll keep the Passover at your house with my disciples." And, as you go through and you read all of the accounts where Jesus began to observe this final Passover meal, that's what it was. The disciples said, "Where do you want us to prepare the Passover?" And Jesus told them, "You go here, and there you prepare the Passover." And the account that was that was given when you find that Jesus sat down in Luke chapter 22, verse 14. When the hour was come, he sat down and the 12 apostles with him, and he said unto them, with desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. So it was the Passover. The disciples expected to keep the Passover. Christ told them, this is where you go and prepare the Passover. When he sat down with them, the hour was come, the proper time. He said, I have really desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Now, the Passover is the 14th, and the 15th is the high day, the Holy Convocation. So Christ ate the Passover with them and was crucified on the daylight portion. You know, Paul explains in 1 Corinthians 11 that which I received of the Lord I delivered unto you. That on the same night that he was betrayed, he took bread and broke it. You see, he celebrated the Passover with them on the night prior to his betrayal and his crucifixion during the daylight hours of the Passover. And as that daylight period of the 14th was coming to an end, the Sabbath was drawing near. But which Sabbath? The weekly Sabbath? Saturday? No. That Sabbath was a high day, John tells us in John 19:31, as we just saw. Now, let's come and notice here some of the details brought out in the four gospel accounts. Matthew 27, it tells us of the events of the crucifixion. And we find the death that is described as Jesus yielded up the Spirit, verse 50, cried out, and the spear stabbed into him. He died. Verse 51, the veil of the temple was rent in two, and there was a great earthquake, and graves were opened. Many bodies of the saints which slept arose and came out of the graves after the resurrection. The graves were opened at the time that he died when the earthquake occurred, but they didn't they weren't restored to life until after his resurrection. And they were restored to to physical life, as Lazarus was. These were individuals who appeared in Jerusalem who were told here in verse 53, they went after the resurrection, they went in the holy city and appeared to many. Now, these were people that were known. They were individuals who had recently died. Somebody just walked into Jerusalem and said, hello, my name's Abraham. Who'd believe that? If somebody walked in the door and said, my name's George Washington, you wouldn't believe that. How would he establish his identity? But if somebody walked in the door whose funeral you had attended last month, your cousin, your neighbor, and he said, I'm so-and-so, well, after they picked you up off the floor, and sort of, you sort of recovered from your faint, someone who had recently died could clearly establish his identity. The point of this, these were individuals who were known, who were testimony to the resurrection, to the power of God to raise the dead. And so they were individuals who had evidently recently died. They were resurrected after Christ's resurrection, came into the city and bore testimony of the power of God to raise the dead. Must have created quite a stir. Now, Christ died, as this is described here. The earthquake occurs. And verse 55, many women were there beholding afar off. These were women that followed him from Galilee, ministering unto him, and mentioned several that were there, including Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's children, Salome, as she's called elsewhere. Now, when evening was come, there came a rich man of Arimathea named Joseph, who also himself was Jesus' disciple. And he went to Pilate and begged the body. And Pilate commanded the body to be delivered. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, laid it in his own tomb, which was hewn out of a rock, and rolled a great stone, and departed. And there was Mary Magdalene and the other Mary sitting over against the sepulchre. And the next day that followed the day of the preparation, so this is the high day Sabbath, the chief priests and Pharisees came together unto Pilate and said, Sir, we remember that deceiver said, while he was yet alive, after 3 days I will rise again. Command therefore that the sepulchre be made sure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away, and say unto the people, He's risen from the dead. Pilate said, You have your watch, go your way, make it as sure as you can. So they went, made the sepulchre sure, sealing the stone and setting a watch. Now the enemies had the opportunity to make make the tomb as secure as they could. So you know they did the very best job they were capable of doing. Now it's interesting, Christ said, no sign is going to be given you, speaking to the religious leaders. You know, in a very special, unique sense, that sign was given for them. Because they were the ones who sealed the tomb and set the guard. So they had their own eyewitnesses there who could tell them what happened. And they were the ones who sealed the tomb, so they knew it was well sealed. You know, if somebody else sealed the tomb, you can say, well, I don't think he did a very good job. You know, he must have done a pretty sloppy job. He didn't lock the door, see. But if you're the one who did it, then you know. Oh, you can tell other people any story you want. But you know. You see, they had the opportunity to seal the tomb and to handpick their guards and post them there. And so they went and they made it sure, and they sealed the stone and they set a watch. Now, chapter 28 tells us, in the end of the Sabbath began to dawn toward the first day of the week, came Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to see the sepulchre. And in what they saw was an angel, whose countenance was like lightning and his raiment white as snow. And for fear of him, the keepers did shake and become as dead men. You better believe they did. You know, these big Roman soldiers standing there, and they're pretty tough. All of a sudden, you know, an angel appears, and they just begin to shake and quake and just fall over. Scared them absolutely to death. And the angel answered and said to the women, Don't fear. I know you seek Jesus, which was crucified. He's not here. He's risen. Come see the place where the Lord lay. Go quickly and tell His disciples He's risen from the dead, and He goes before you into Galilee. And there shall you see Him. Now, let's come on forward to Mark. Let's notice all 4 of the accounts. When you come back to Mark 15, Mark 15, verse 37, Jesus cried with a loud voice, gave up the spirit. The veil of the temple was rent in two from top to bottom. The centurion which stood over against him saw that he cried out and gave up the spirit, and they said, Truly, this man was the Son of God. You know, they were right there, and it was a scary experience. You know, they were standing there, they saw the darkness come over the land, they saw it hang absolutely dark for 3 hours. They saw what happened. They saw him die, and instantly, you know, the sky began to lighten. This huge earthquake struck. All of these events, they knew something far out of the ordinary had happened. Now, there were also the women looking on afar off, verse 40. It mentions several of them. And there were many other women that had come up with him to Jerusalem. And verse 42, Now, when the evening was come, because it was the preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath. John, of course, is the one who adds in the detail that it was the high day Sabbath. Joseph of Arimathea, an honorable counselor, which waited for the kingdom of God, came and went in boldly unto Pilate and craved the body of Jesus. You know, this was a bold action because you're coming in and requesting the body of a man who's been executed as a criminal. You're identifying yourself with him. That was a bold action. The whole place was in turmoil. The religious leaders of the Jews had just joined together to have him killed. Pilate had signed the death decree, and so Joseph comes up here to the palace, wants to see the governor, and says, I want the body released to me. That's a pretty bold action. And Pilate marveled if he were already dead. And he called unto him the centurion, and he asked him whether he had been dead. And when he knew it of the centurion, he gave the body to Joseph. Now, Christ died at 3 o'clock, approximately. We're told that it was the 9th hour, so that's 3 o'clock by, figuring from sunset, which was the way, from sunrise, which was the way they normally did, 12 hours to the day, and beginning, let's say, at approximately sunrise, sunrise, about 6 o'clock in the morning. The 6th hour to the 9th hour would have been from noon until 3 p.m. So he died about 3 hours before sunset. But Joseph then when Joseph knew he was dead, we don't know exactly, there's not a mention if Joseph was right there at the crucifixion. There's no mention that he was. Somebody may have gone into town and told Joseph, and then he went to Pilate's palace. He had to come up and request admittance, and however many minutes went by, and so Pilate let him in, and he had the conversation. Pilate marveled that he were already dead. He suspected something maybe was going on, so he didn't want to take Joseph's word for it. He sent a centurion, sent one of his Roman officers who was there in the palace, said, "You go and find out." So he went down there and was assured by the Roman soldiers there that, yes, he's dead. Then he came back. So he had to go out of the city, and then he came back. So time has elapsed. Now Joseph is given a decree by Pilate, just, a note that Pilate signed and sealed that gave Joseph the authority to go out and take possession of the body. So clearly now you're getting on probably close to 5 o'clock in the afternoon by the time this happens. You've had this exchange back and forth. They didn't get on their cell phone and call one another. They had to make the trip back and forth. So Joseph, verse 46, he bought fine linen, took him down, wrapped him in the linen, laid him in the sepulchre, which was hewn, rolled a stone on it. And there were a couple of the women that beheld where he was laid. Chapter 16, verse 1. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome had bought sweet spices that they might come and anoint him. When the Sabbath was past, they had bought the sweet spices. Notice that. Very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came unto the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. They said among themselves, "Who will roll away the stone?" And when they looked, they saw the stone was rolled away. Entering the sepulchre, they saw this angel sitting there, appeared as a young man, and they were scared. And he said, "You seek Jesus of Nazareth, which was crucified. He's risen. He's not here. Behold the place where they laid him. Go and tell his disciples and Peter that he goes before you into Galilee." Now let's come on back to Luke's account. Luke tells us that we'll pick it up in Luke 23:50. "Behold, there was a man named Joseph, a counselor, and he was a good man and a just. The same had not consented to the counsel indeed of them." So he was a member of the council. He was a member of the Sanhedrin. He had refused to go along with their death sentence. He had refused to go along with what they had done. He was of Arimathea, a city of the Jews, who also himself waited for the kingdom of God. This man went unto Pilate and begged the body. And he took it down, wrapped it in linen, laid it in a sepulchre that was hewed in a stone, where never man before was laid. And that day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew on. The women also which came with him from Galilee followed after, beheld the sepulchre and how his body was laid, and they returned and prepared spices and ointments and rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment. And upon the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they came to the sepulchre bringing the spices that they had prepared, and certain others with them. And they found the stone rolled away. Now, John adds in the detail in John 19:38. "After this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, besought Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him leave. He came therefore and took the body of Jesus. There came also Nicodemus, which at first came to Jesus by night, and brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100-pound weight. They took the body of Jesus, wound it in linen clothes with the spices after the manner of the Jews to bury. Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre, They laid Jesus, therefore, because of the Jews' preparation day, the sepulchre was near at hand. And then it describes the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came early while it was yet dark unto the sepulchre and saw the stone taken away. It's interesting. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus had clearly believed the message of Jesus. They were both secret disciples. Because you remember the Jews, the Pharisees, had made the point that if any man acknowledged Jesus as the Messiah, they were going to throw him out of the synagogue. And they had threatened everyone. Joseph and Nicodemus were prominent men. Nicodemus, you read of him in John chapter 3. He was a ruler of the Jews, we're told. A man of prominence. John 3:1, there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. Nicodemus and Joseph was a counselor. He was a member of the council, the Sanhedrin. So was Nicodemus. He was a ruler, one of the governing body. Here were men of wealth and prominence. They believed the truth, but they didn't say anything about it to anybody. They just sort of kept their mouths shut. 3 years went by. Sooner or later there comes a crisis. And we have to make a decision, make a stand. The crisis point for Joseph and Nicodemus came when Jesus was brought to trial. And at this point, what were they going to do? They'd been quiet up until now. Well, we're told that Joseph did not consent. He refused, and I think it's very clear Nicodemus did as well. They refused to give their consent. Then Joseph came boldly before Pilate and asked for the body. Nicodemus, at this point, had made a decision as well. And he came and he was bringing things for the burial. And he and Joseph met and went on out, and they took the body and quickly laid it because it was the preparation day. The Sabbath was drawing near. And they needed to get this tended to before sunset. But John makes plain in John 19:31 that Sabbath was not the regular weekly Sabbath. That Sabbath was a high day. Mark 16:1 tells us that Mary Magdalene and the other ladies bought sweet spices after the Sabbath was passed. Luke, on the other hand, tells us, Luke 23:56 tells us that the women prepared the spices and ointments and rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment. And yet, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all three make plain that Jesus was laid in the tomb right at sunset. They rushed in the burial because the Sabbath was drawing on. And they were anxious to get this tended to before sunset. It tells us in John 19:42, they laid Jesus therefore because of the Jews' preparation, for the Sabbath was, the sepulchre was nigh at hand. It was close by. And Luke 23:54, the day was the preparation and the Sabbath drew on. It was getting right close to sunset. And they had to carry out all of these things, going back and forth and getting the body, getting it down, doing everything they did. They had less than 3 hours to do all of this. And you're talking about people walking. You're talking about going back and forth a distance in and out of town. You're talking about having to wait and stand in line. And if you've ever tried to go to a government office, you don't just walk right in. If you're an important man like Joseph, you might get in a few minutes. But the Roman governor was not someone who was so impressed with the importance of the Jews that he was willing to just, drop everything he was doing in a moment's notice. Well, how could they have waited until after the Sabbath was passed and then bought sweet spices, prepared the sweet spices, and then rested the Sabbath according to the commandment? Well, you see, Luke specifies which Sabbath it was, the Sabbath according to the commandment. Speaking of, in other words, the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, the one mentioned in the Ten Commandments. You see, it was just like it was this year. Christ was crucified on Wednesday. the Passover. He was laid in the tomb late Wednesday afternoon, just before sunset, just before the night to be much observed, the first holy day of unleavened bread began, the high day Sabbath. After the Sabbath was passed, after the high day was over, you see, after Thursday was over, on Friday, the women went out and bought spices because the shops were open in Jerusalem again. And they went out and bought them. And as you read about the customs, I mean, when they bought the spices, these were things that had to be crushed up. They had to be, in some cases, cooked and put together. You know, they spent a good portion of the day going and getting what they wanted and preparing it. So Mark makes plain that they bought it after the Sabbath was passed. Luke makes plain they prepared it and then rested the Sabbath according to the commandment. So, when the high day Sabbath on Thursday was passed, they bought it Friday morning, spent Friday in preparation. By that time, it was almost Sabbath. So they rested the Sabbath according to the commandment. So the very first opportunity, they had to go to the tomb to embalm the body, and that's what they were going for. They left out Sunday morning before sunrise, just as soon as there was a little bit of light to see, figuring that by the time they got there, it'd be daylight. Now, they hadn't really thought it through, because as they were on the way, they said, now, you know, the tomb is sealed. That's a big rock. How are we going to get that moved? And they discussed it. Well, when they got there, they didn't have to worry about moving the rock. It was gone. It was gone. And that was the case. Now, there's one verse that is that people sometimes get confused about because of the way that it's translated. We'll just take note of it here. And that is the statement that where you read about Mary Magdalene, and you read about when Jesus appeared to her. And that is in Mark 16:9. The way it's translated in the King James is a little misleading. Now, part of the problem, or the entire problem, arises from the punctuation. There were no commas in the original manuscript. Those have all been, that's something that has come into use later and was added in by, the punctuation was added by the translators. And sometimes there's more than one way of punctuating a sentence. And the way it's punctuated can make a difference in how it's understood. Mark 16:9, the King James translates it, "Now when Jesus was risen early the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast the 7 demons." Well, translated that way, it gives the implication he was raised early the first day of the week. But notice, let's read it again. "Now when Jesus was risen, early the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene." Oh, all of a sudden, you get just a matter where you put the comma. Now, Jesus said he was going to be in the grave 3 days and 3 nights. He was buried just prior to sunset. Buried at sunset. Well, 3 days and 3 nights later is going to bring you to sunset. You know, 1 day and 1 night. If he was buried 3 days and 3 nights, and he's buried Wednesday at sunset. 1 day and 1 night later, that brings you through Wednesday night and the daylight portion of Thursday. 2 days and 2 nights brings you on through the nighttime portion of Thursday and the daylight portion of Friday. 3 days and 3 nights brings you on through the nighttime portion of Friday and the daylight portion of Saturday. And, in other words, he would have been resurrected just at the end of the weekly Sabbath. The women arrived early the next morning, as soon as light, not to celebrate the resurrection, but to embalm a dead body. When they got there, the tomb was empty. Because he had risen as he had said. That's what the angel told them. He said, he has risen as he said. And that is the point. He was raised from the dead just exactly as he said he would be. Well, he said he would be raised 3 days and 3 nights. See, the Pharisees and religious leaders knew that. Matthew 27:28, they told Pilate, he said, after 3 days I will rise again. And the angel told them in Matthew 28, 5 and 6, the angel answered, said unto the women, fear not, I know you seek Jesus which was crucified. He's not here, for he's risen, as he said. Come see the place where the Lord lay. He was raised just as he said, after 3 days and 3 nights in the tomb. Now it's interesting, at the time that Jesus was raised from the dead, what occurred? What ceremony was going on? The priest was cutting the first sheaf of barley. The priest was cutting the first sheaf of barley. We read about that in Leviticus 23. It was to be waved before the Lord, presented. This omer, an omer is about 2 quarts, and so that was about the amount of it. It was presented, waved before God in the temple. Now, it's interesting as you go through the account, because what we find is that Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene. That was the first one that saw him, that had come out there to the tomb. The tomb was empty. Mary Magdalene had come back, and she was just upset and didn't know what was going on. You know, the angel had told her, but she just couldn't comprehend it. She came back, and she was crying, standing outside the tomb. And the account is given in John chapter 20. See, Mary stood outside the sepulchre weeping, we're told in verse 11. And in verse 13, they said unto her, the 2 angels, Woman, why do you weep? And she said, Because they've taken away my Lord, and I know not where they've laid him. She couldn't grasp, she couldn't comprehend that he was raised from the dead. All she could see was that somebody had moved the body. And when she had thus said, she turned herself back, and she saw Jesus standing, and knew not that it was Jesus. And Jesus said unto her, Woman, why do you weep? Whom do you seek? She, supposing him to be the gardener, said unto him, Sir, if you've borne him hence, tell me where you've laid him, and I'll take him away. And Jesus said unto her, Mary. And she turned herself. Then she looked at him squarely, and she said unto him, Rabboni, which is to say, Master. And Jesus said unto her, Touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brethren and say unto them, I ascend unto my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Now, as you read other accounts, we find that later on, Jesus allowed others to hold him, to touch him, and that description is given later on. He even invited Thomas to stick his hand in his side and his fingers in the nail holes. So he allowed others to touch him later. But he told Mary early that morning, I'm not yet ascended to my Father. And you see later on in Matthew 28:9, as they went to tell his disciples, Jesus met them saying, All hail, and they came and held him by the feet and worshipped him. Now early that morning, he told Mary, don't touch me. Later on, he allowed them to come, to fall before him, to grab him, embrace him, hold him around the feet. He didn't tell them not to. He told Mary, don't touch me, for I'm not yet ascended to my Father. You see, as we read in Leviticus 23, there was a ceremony that was carried out on Sunday morning at the time of the morning sacrifice in the temple. The sheaf that had been cut loose the evening before, was now presented to God. And it was the first fruits. It was only after that that the first fruits harvest could begin. Now notice back in 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15:20, now is Christ risen from the dead and become the first fruits of them that slept. Since by man came death, by man came also the resurrection. As in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive, but every man in his own order. Christ the first fruits, afterward they that are Christ at his coming. You see, Jesus Christ was the first fruits. And it is through Him that we might have life. His resurrection occurred at the time that began the first fruits harvest. The physical first fruits harvest in ancient Israel was a type of God's spiritual first fruits harvest. We, the church, are called in James chapter 1 and verse 18, the first fruits of all His creatures. We become a kind of first fruits of all His creatures. And so Christ was the first of the first fruits. The symbolism is particularly appropriate to focus on this year because it just so happens that the days of the week and the timing of the holy days comes exactly the way it did in the year that Christ was crucified. So it makes it easy to see and to be laid out. God gives us a pattern to worship Him that focuses our attention on all of the aspects of His plan. And we see it illustrated as it is, not based on the ideas of Emperor Constantine and the practices of the Roman Church, but based on the revealed Word of God, kept by Christ and the apostles and the church that Jesus built, the church that originated with the apostles and continued on down to our time. That's what real apostolic Christianity is, a continuation of the church that Jesus built.